Hello, hello, hello. Hello, friends. Hello, 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 and welcome to Hinds Feet on High Places. We are week 8, episode 15. We are on chapter 10 tonight. So I want to welcome those of you who are just joining us for our live tonight. Let me know when you are on. I would love to know when you have popped in. For some reason, every time I look at my live numbers, they go up and down. Last week, I know that I had several people on. I had like 5 or 6 on at least during any point in time, and it was telling me I had none. So, hello, Miss Bree. So good to see you. Hello, Anne. Hello, good to see you. Your purple heart emojis. I love them so much. Hello, Jody. Hello, hello, Janet. Hello to those of you who are joining us. Thank you so much for letting us know that you are here. I love each and every one of your smiling faces. I imagine you on the other side joining me live. So it is so good to see all of you. So good to have you joining us. Tonight we are doing yes, hello, Miss Sandy. So good to see you. So glad that you made it. I thank you for your little note on Facebook not long ago. I made it as well. So we are here. All is good. Hello, Miss Melissa. So good to see you. Hello, Judith. You made it tonight. So good to see you. I love all of you joining on live for tonight's session. Hello, Miss Reba. So good to see you. Thank you for the wonderful emojis. I love seeing all of the color. It makes my night. It is so good to have all of you here. It is one thing to do this, to study this on my own, but it is a whole nother thing to be studying with a group of ladies. So I am so glad that all of you have joined me tonight. Again, if you are just popping on, I would love to know that you are here. Just go ahead and leave us an emoji when you pop on. Welcome to our replayers. We know that we have a lot of people. It's really quite funny. My husband looks at these lives on our YouTube. Our YouTube app from our Apple TV. And a lot of times it will pop up because, of course, he subscribes to my channel. Like a good husband, he subscribes to my channel. And one of my videos will often come up as a suggestion to him. And he doesn't really realize that these go an hour and a half. And he's like, an hour and a half and 50 people watched it. And I'm like, yeah, babe, isn't that cool? So we know that if we only have between 8 and 10 of us who are doing these lives every single night, we know that we have a substantial amount of people who are doing the replay. So we want to welcome those who are just signing on to our replay now, whether this is tonight, tomorrow, next week, next month, welcome. So tonight we are going to be in chapter 10, and we're going to be reading starting in page 119. We are in chapter 10. This is week 8. If you can absolutely believe it, I can't. We are in week 8, episode 15. I can hardly believe that we are that far along. But it's just been fabulous. I was telling my best friend the other day, who I read this with a few months ago, I told her, I said, this is by far so good that I'm doing this again, because I am getting so much more out of it now than I did when I first read it. And I just first read it a few months ago. So it is so good. I apologize for the way that I look tonight. I had a very busy day. My daughter is pregnant with our first grandbaby, as many of you already know, and we are getting ready for her baby shower on Saturday. So I have a huge week planned, and I was doing a lot of running, a lot of shopping, a lot of cleaning, organizing, getting ready, and this is what you have. I took a shower at 3 p.m. this afternoon, and I decided, you know what? I'm just not doing any hair or makeup today. So this is what you have, all lovely and looking like a mess, but that's okay. I posted on our Facebook page that I've been suffering with a lot of pain in my neck. I did something to it. I'm not sure what I did to it. I don't know if it's something that has been happening over time that I'm doing repetitively, like the way that I'm sleeping or what. Thank you, Miss Sandy. Anyway, I've been in a great deal of pain here in my neck. And so I go back to the doctor tomorrow. I get a vaccination tomorrow for the whooping cough, because I have to be prepared for this little baby that is coming. And upon doing that, I'm going to be asking for maybe some ibuprofen, maybe some 800 milligrams or something that can help me, because I don't know otherwise how I'm going to be able to get through to this weekend. Thank you, Jody. You guys are so sweet, but I appreciate your comments. But yeah, this is, like I said, I just decided, you know what, today is a real day. It is just real, and this is what we get, and we're working with, and I'm fine with it if you're fine with it. So, all right, so we are going to start out our reading tonight. We have a shorter chapter tonight than we've had in the past. I am hoping to get all the way through this. This is my goal, is to get all the way through this. But those of you who know me well and have been around here since the beginning know that I can't do anything very quickly. In fact, I laughed a few months ago, or well, I should say several months ago. I was invited to come and speak at a women's retreat where I was given 3 30-minute sessions to talk about Bible journaling. And I laughed because I said, there's no way that I can do anything in 30 minutes, let alone teach people how to Bible journal. I will do my best, but I even laughed and I said, I don't even sneeze in 30 minutes. Like, I have a hard time doing anything in 30 minutes. It's just not enough time for me. I barely get my hellos out within 30 minutes. So anyway, I'm going to hope to get all the way through this chapter tonight. If I don't, that's fine. We're just going at a normal pace here, and we're just doing what we can and getting through what we can, because we understand that there is so much meat in this book that we don't want to miss. Thank you, Mama. Yeah, today has been a really, well, I should say this weekend was a really challenging weekend with the pain, but we've got my water. I've got my big jug of water. I'm trying to drink lots and lots of water, and massaging and heat and ice and all of that good stuff. So all right, so we are going to start out. We want to kind of pick up where we left off last time that we were together, which was Wednesday of last week. And we were in chapter 9. And in that, the very last thing that we talked about in that chapter was, if you remember, where the Good Shepherd, he made this decision to rope suffering and sorrow with much afraid being in the middle. And they were to go, she was to go with them, so that if something happened and she lost her traction, or if she became not so sure-footed anymore, that she would have protection for herself. He also gave her some cordial. We talked about kind of what that was, which was in fact defined for us on page 116, a spirit of grace and comfort. And she was to drink this, and it would get her through feeling strengthened again. And there was this line that we talked greatly about on page 116, that although there were still sensations of dread in her heart, we kind of talked about that. And then there was a place that she was to come and rest for the night, where the Good Shepherd had led her to go. And he said that if you stay here at the bottom of the precipice, your enemies will most likely steal you and harm you. However, if you follow up this track that you are going, you will be beyond their reach. Though I doubt not, he added warningly, that you will meet them again after you reach the top. So that is kind of the place where we were at as we finished our reading together. And I just want to read before let's say I didn't think through this, what we want to do. Let's go ahead and read the chapter. I will go ahead and just read starting on page 119. Let's just get the reading done first, and then we're going to go back to read the Higher Way devotional on page 118. So are we ready? We are ready here. So let's just get into chapter 10, the ascent of the precipice injury. Once on the track, Much Afraid discovered to her surprise and deep thankfulness that it was not nearly as appalling in actual fact as it seemed in anticipation. Steep, difficult, and slippery it certainly was, and also painfully narrow, but the feeling of being securely roped to her strong companions was very reassuring. Also, the cordial of the spirit of grace and comfort, which she had just drunk, kept her from feeling giddy and faint when she looked over the edge, the thing she had most dreaded. Moreover, for the first half hour of their ascent, the rainbow still shone above them, and though the shepherd had disappeared from view, Much Afraid had a lovely sense that he was still close beside them. She did not look down unless obliged to do so, but once, quite soon after they had started, she had to wait in the little niche in the rock at one of the difficult places, while sorrow felt her way forward and suffering waited in the rear. Just then she looked down and felt very thankful indeed that the shepherd had charged them to start the ascent that evening and not spend the night down below. Sitting on the rocks below were all five of her enemies, gazing up at them and grimacing with fury and spite. Indeed, as she looked, she was startled to see self pity always look less ugly and dangerous than his companions, stoop down and pick up a sharp stone which he flung at her with all of his might. Fortunately, they were already practically out of reach of the stone throwing, but the jagged piece did hit the cliff just below her, and Much Afraid was greatly relieved when she felt Sorrow pull gently on the rope to tell her that she now could move forward. She remembered the shepherd's warning that she was likely to meet these enemies again when the precipice was surmounted, though how they would get up to the Mount Injury she did not know, only that there must be some other way which they could see. So the three of them climbed higher and higher, while the shadows thrown by the cliffs lengthened over the plain below, and the sun went down in a blaze of glory beyond the desert and the great sea. From the height which they had now reached, they could plainly see the western sea along the shores of which they had traveled for so long. The track they followed wound up ever upward toward the fourth back and forth across the face of the cliff. And though it was crumbling and even broken in some places, Much Afraid was tremendously relieved to find that nowhere at all was it too difficult, not even at the spot halfway up the cliff which Craven Fear had so particularly pointed out to her. On arriving there, just as darkness fell, she found that though the path had indeed broken right away, a plank had been laid across the gap and a rope placed through iron rings in the rock face to form a hundrail to which she could cling as she walked across the narrow bridge. The Hart and the Hind, of course, had disdained such unnecessary assistance and had leaped across the chasm, making it look as though there was nothing there. However, even with the handrail to steady her, Much Afraid was very careful to close her imagination altogether to the picture which Craven Fear had painted. From bitter experience, she knew that pictures thrown on the screen of her imagination could seem much worse, more unner or I'm sorry, could seem much more unnerving and terrible than the actual facts. When the plank was crossed safely, they discovered themselves to be in an exceedingly narrow gorge, quite invisible from below. Directly facing them was the very resting place which the shepherd had spoken of, a little cave where they were to pass the night. With a sense of great relief and thankfulness, she went inside and looked around. Its situation was such that though she could not look down into the dizzy depths beneath, it was possible to look right out over the plateau and the desert to the far off sea. The moon had just risen and was shedding a pure light, silver light over everything, and the first stars appeared like faint flickers in the darkening sky. In the cave itself, flat rocks had been placed to form rude seats and a table, and on the ground at one side were piled sheepskins on which they could rest. Not far from the cave entrance, a tiny waterfall trickled down the cliff, and they went to it in turn and refreshed themselves. Then Sorrow and Suffering produced 2 packages of bread and dried fruits and nuts, which the shepherd had given them at the foot of the ascent. With these, they gladly satisfied their hunger, and then, overcome by weariness, they laid themselves down in the cave and fell into dreamless slumber. Much Afraid woke with first light of dawn, and getting up, walked to the entrance of the cave. In the cold light of early morning, she could not help telling herself that the scene of utter desolation lay before her. As far as the eye could see was nothing but empty plain and sea, with towering cliffs above her and jagged rock below. The pleasant wooded country, scarcely a stunted bush. How desolate, thought Much Afraid. And those rocks beneath look very cruel indeed, as if they are waiting to injure and destroy anything which falls upon them. It seems as though nothing can grow anywhere in all of this barren waste. Just then she looked up the cliffs above her head and started with surprise and delight. In a tiny crevice of the rock, where a few drops from the trickling waterfall would occasionally sprinkle it, was a single plant. It had just two or three leaves, and one fragile stem, almost hair-like in its slenderness, grew out at right angles to the wall. On the stem was one flower, blood red in color, which glowed like a lamp or flame or fire in the early rays of the sun. Much afraid, stared at it for some moments, noticing the wall which completely imprisoned it, the minute aperture through which it had forced its way to the light, and the barren loneliness of its surroundings. Its roots were clamped around by sheer rock, and its leaves scarcely able to press outside the prison house. Yet it had insisted on bursting into bloom, and was holding its little face open to the sun and bursting like a flame of joy. As she looked up at it, much afraid, asked, as she had in the desert, "What is your name, little flower? For indeed I never saw another like you." At that moment the sun touched the blood red petals, so that they shone more vividly than ever, and a little whisper rustled from the leaves. "My name is Bearing the Cost, but some call me Forgiveness." Then, much afraid, recalled the words of the shepherd: "On the way up to the precipice, you will discover the next letter of the alphabet of love. Begin to practice it at once." She gazed at the little flower and again said, "Why call you that?" Once more a little whispering laugh passed through the leaves, and she thought she heard them say, "I was separated from all my companions, exiled from home, carried here, and imprisoned in this rock. It was not my choice, but the work of others who, when they had dropped me here, went away and left me to bear the results of what they had done. I have borne and have not fainted. I have not ceased to love, and love helped me push through the crack in the rock until I could look right out onto my love, the sun himself. See now, there is nothing whatever between my love and my heart, nothing around to distract me from him. He shines upon me and makes me rejoice, and he has atoned to me for all that was taken from me and done against me. There is no flower in all of the world more blessed or more satisfied than I, for I look up to him as a weaned child and say, whom have I in heaven but thee? And there is none upon the earth that I desire but thee." Much afraid, looked at the glowing flame above her head, and a longing which was almost envy leaped into her heart. She knew what she must do. Kneeling on the narrow path beneath the imprisoned flower, she said, "O my Lord, behold me. I am thy little handmaiden, bearing the cost." At that moment, a fragment of rock which imprisoned the roots of the flower above her loosened and fell to her feet. She picked it up and put it very gently with the other 7 stones in her purse, then returned to the cave. Sorrow and Suffering were waiting for her with a further supply of bread and raisins and nuts, and after they had given thanks and had eaten, they roped themselves together again and continued up the precipice. After a little they came to a place which was very steep and slippery. Suddenly, Much Afraid had her first fall and cut herself quite badly on the pieces of jagged rock which had tripped her. It was a good thing she was so securely roped, for a great terror came upon her, and she became so giddy and faint that had she not been tied, she might have slipped over the edge of the path and been dashed to pieces on the rocks below. As this thought struck her, she was so overcome with panic and trembling that all she could do was to crouch against the wall and rock and cry out to her companions that she was fainting and was in terror of falling. Immediately, Sorrow, who was in front, tightened the rope. Then Suffering came to her, put her arms around her, and said urgently, "Drink some of the cordial which the shepherd gave you." Much Afraid was so faint and frightened that she could only lie in the arms of Suffering and gasp, "I don't know where the bottle is. I can't move, even to fumble for it." Suffering herself put her hand into the bosom of this fainting girl, drew out the bottle, and poured a few drops between her lips. After a few moments, the color returned to Much Afraid's cheeks, and the faintness began to pass off. But still she could not move. She took more of the spirit of grace and comfort and began to feel strengthened. Then Sorrow, who had come back to the place where she was crouching, gently shortened the rope so that Much Afraid could take her hand, and again they started to climb. In the fall, however, Much Afraid had cut both knees so severely that she could only limp forward very painfully, moaning continually and halting constantly. Her companions were very patient, but progress was so slow that finally it became necessary to make greater speed, or they would not reach the top of the precipice before nightfall, and there was no other cave where they could rest. At last, Suffering stooped over and asked, much afraid, "What are you doing? What were you doing when you left the cave this morning and went off by yourself?" Much Afraid gave her a startled look, and then, with a painful flush, I was looking for a I'm sorry. I was looking at a flower which I had not seen before growing in the rock by the waterfall. "What flower was that?" persisted Suffering very gently. "It was the flower of bearing the cost," replied Much Afraid in a very low voice, "but some call it forgiveness." For a few moments she was silent, remembering the altar she had built and realizing that she was not practicing this new and difficult letter of the alphabet of love. Then said she, "I wonder if it would help my knees if we put a few drops of the cordial on them." "Let us try," said Sorrow and Suffering together. "It is an excellent suggestion." As they dropped a little of the cordial on both knees, almost at once the bleeding ceased, and the worst of the worst of the smart and pain died away. Her legs remained very stiff, and she's still obliged to limp quite badly, but they did go forward at much better pace. By late afternoon, they were right at the top of the awful ascent and found themselves in the forest of young pine trees with moss and blueberries growing on the banks beside the path, and the precipice, which had looked so impassable, was actually behind them. They sat down on one of the mossy banks in the wood to rest, then heard a voice singing quite close at hand. "Thou art all fair, my dearest love, there is no spot in thee. Come with me to the heights above, yet fair visions see. Up to the mount of myrrh and thence, across the hills of frankincense, to where the dawn's clear innocence bids all the shadows flee. Come with me, O fairest dear, with me to Lebanon. Look from the peaks of grim Shenir, Amana and Hermon. The lions have their dens up there, the leopards prowl the glens up there. But from the top the view is clear of land yet to be won." There, coming toward them, through a clearing in the trees, was the shepherd himself. Ooh, okay, so we are making the ascent of the precipice of Mount Injury. Now, I want to go back before we begin our notes for this evening. I want to go back to page 118 and talk through the higher way. Now, I know that I don't every single week go through the devotional section, but I think that this particular week was super good. It says this: "Do you often have pictures thrown on the screen of your imagination?" I want you to write that word down. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Imagination that tempt you to be fearful or angry and thus draw you out of his presence. So let me read this again, because I think that this is so good that we don't want to miss it. It says, "Do you often have pictures thrown on the screen of your imagination that tempt you to be fearful or angry and thus draw you out of his presence? At such times, we must exert ourselves to obey Jesus' instructions." And then there's Colossians 3:2 in the Amplified Version that says, "And set your minds and keep them set on what is above, the higher things, not on the things that are on this earth." Now, we're going to talk a great deal about this. This is so much of what tonight is going to be about. Then it goes on to say, "Keep to his path." Here is God's description of the path he has chosen for us. Matthew 7:14. "For the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and few are those who find it." As you walk this path with him, you find precious resting places of refreshment. You are protected from looking into those things that would entangle you. Choose to set your mind today upon him and refuse the imaginations of the enemy. Now, I want to implore you, if you have not had an opportunity yet to preview or look at or watch the video that I posted yesterday on Sunday. So I posted it Sunday, October, what was yesterday, the 17th. I implore you to go and watch that video. It is a video that I pre-recorded for an event that I spoke at last Wednesday. It is called um, um, I see the enemy coming, or I see him coming. He has nothing in me. Now this is stems from, I think it's John 16:30, where Jesus is speaking to his disciples, and it is the very, very end of his time with them. He's getting ready to be arrested. He's getting ready to go to the cross. He has told his disciples all that he needs to tell them about what is to come. He had just finished telling them about the Holy Spirit and about how the Holy Spirit was going to be the replacement of Jesus's physical body there with them. And he is telling again them everything that is going to happen, everything that is to know. And he says to them, I'm not going to talk to you much longer. I see the enemy coming, and he has nothing in me. And I gave a challenge, if you will, in that video that I would highly encourage you to watch. Now, it is one that I have said from the beginning that if there's no other video that you watch that is important in this day, in this time period that we are in as a country, as a nation, as a world, it is this video. We have to get it in our bones about how we behave when we see the enemy coming. I see him coming, but it is only in my imagination where I picture that he has more control than he has. It is only in my imagination. It is only me thinking the very worst thing that I could possibly think. It's all this stuff that is in my imagination. How can we look at what is happening, see him coming, and say, he has nothing in me? That is a great video. It's like 36, 38 minutes long or something like that. I implore you, if there's one video that I would like you to watch out of any of them that I have recorded thus far, it is that one. So let's just go ahead and get started on today's notes that I have prepared for you. We're going to go back to chapter 1, or I'm sorry, no, we're not going back to chapter 1. We're going back to the first page of chapter 10, page 119. So what is kind of going on here? Well, we see that Much Afraid felt safe and reassured by her companions. There was sorrow that went in the front, and there was suffering that went in the behind, with her in the middle. So we feel like there's some great reassurance that she has with her companions. We see here that there was a rainbow indicated the shepherd's closeness that we can read about in 119. Also, sorrow felt ahead while suffering waited in the rear. Sorrow felt her way up ahead while suffering waited in the rear. Right away on page 119, we read this word anticipation. It says, once on the track, Much Afraid discovered to her surprise and her thankfulness that it wasn't as nearly as appalling in actual fact as it all had anticipated. I want to ask all of you, I am sure that I'm not alone in this. Have you ever anticipated something that turned out being a whole lot easier or a whole lot better than you thought it would? Maybe it was something that you were afraid of. Maybe it was something that scared you half to death. Maybe it was getting up and speaking in front of a crowd of people. And once you got up there, it was easy breezy piece of cake. How often do things turn out to be a lot better than we anticipated for them to be, a lot better than we anticipated in our mind, a lot better than what we imagined may happen? We always go to the worst case scenario. I'm so glad that I'm not alone in that. That is probably one of my faults. If I had to say that there are any faults that I have, which I could say a ton of faults that I have, the highest on the list would be that. Probably number one is that I always anticipate things to be worse than they actually are. I think that this comes from a mindset of not setting up unrealistic expectations for myself. So I've always felt like if I think the very least amount of something, or if I think the very worst of something, and it winds up being better, well, then great. Then at least I am more pleasantly surprised by the outcome than the other. So we find here that this is what is happening, that she anticipated for it to be much worse than it actually was. So to her thankfulness, she is sensing that it was worse than it would have been. Below, we see that there were 5 enemies who were furious and filled with spiteful looks. And it says that in page on page 119. It says, so glad that she had decided to take the good shepherd up um, on his advice to go higher, to go and start on the path higher. It says, sorrow felt her way forward and suffering waited in the rear. Then it says at the top of page 120, it talks about self-pity. So here we are back to self. Isn't this the case where self-pity is one of those things that often looks good to us? Why? Because it speaks to our human side. It speaks to our humanness. It speaks to the comfort of our human side. Self-pity, who always look less ugly. Like I feel a lot of like, poor me, woe is me, right? Down in the dumps me. I can't believe this happened to me. I can't believe they said this about me. I'm having a pity party for myself. Always that looks like the more reasonable way to live, because why? It's more gratifying to our flesh. And so I like that this is kind of the image that we get about self-pity. Look less ugly than the others. And what does he do? He flings a stone at her. But she says, fortunately, they were already practically out of reach of the stone throwing, but the jagged piece did hit the cliff, and Much Afraid was greatly relieved when Sorrow was the one who actually tightened that rope or gently pulled on the rope, causing her to move forward to avoid that jagged piece. It says this on page 120, second paragraph. She remembered the shepherd's warning that she was likely to meet these enemies again when the precipice was surmounted. That she was likely to meet the enemies again when the precipice was surmounted. We see here that the three climbed higher, getting some traction, climbing much higher. Much Afraid was relieved of it being less difficult than she thought it might be. So back to that anticipation. And Much Afraid, it says, was very careful to close her imagination to the picture which craven fear had given to her, or had posed for her. Now I got a little ahead of my notes. It says there on page 120, fourth paragraph down, Much Afraid was tremendously relieved to find that nowhere at all was it too difficult, not even at the spot halfway up the cliff, which Craven Fear had so particularly pointed out to her. So again, she's relieved at this thought that what was imagined in her mind was not as bad as it really was. So on arriving there, just as darkness fell, she found that though the path had indeed broken right away, a plank had been laid across the gap and a rope placed through iron rings in the rock face to form a handrail to which she could cling as she walked along the narrow bridge. So again, more provisions as she walked this very steady stream, and making it look like there was nothing there. And then it says that Much Afraid this is a very huge place. This is where we're going to land for a little bit. This is where we're going to camp out for a little bit. It says, Much Afraid was very careful to close her imagination altogether to the picture which Craven Fear had painted. From bitter experience, she knew that pictures thrown on the screen of her imagination could seem much more unnerving and terrible than actual facts. Now, I want to take you somewhere in Scripture, and I want to talk through this idea of what we do with our imagination. What do we do when our thoughts run wild? What do we do when we are sitting there at night and we're having trouble falling asleep because of all of the anticipation of the next day? Maybe there are some things that are coming up that are overwhelming, some things that we are looking ahead at that are more difficult than what we would like them to be. There are situations that we know that we have to face. There are things that we know that we have to go headlong into at the coming week. And we are just laying in bed and we're frightened and we are scared and we are overcome and we are burdened and we're filled with anxiety. I know that I'm not alone in being there. Now, I am one that I can close my eyes at night and go right to bed. Like, I don't have a problem falling asleep at night. My problem is if I get up to go to the bathroom or if I get up early enough to be like 4 o'clock hour when I know my alarm goes off at 5, when I have that sudden like I'm awake and I can't go back to sleep. It is in that time when I think about all of the things of the day, or I think about all of the things that are worrying me, or that I have dread about, or that I am not looking forward to. I have come to be known as having a piece of paper, a pad of paper, a notebook or something, and a pen laying beside my nightstand or laying on my nightstand beside me at night, because a lot of times it is my best thinking. Now, it's not that it's the most beneficial thinking, but a lot of times that is where the most that's when I get the most of my thinking and my worrying. So I want to take you to somewhere in scripture that I thought about when I came to this place in the book, and that is 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5. And I want to read to you what we read here in this section of scripture. And I just kind of want to read the first few first few verses, because I like to do that instead of just jumping headlong into the middle of a chapter. But I want to read to you 2 Corinthians 10. And I'm going to read 1 through 5. And it says this. It says, "Now I, Paul, appeal to you with the gentleness and kindness of Christ, though I realize you think I am timid in person and bold only when I write from afar. Well, I am begging you now so that when I come, I won't have to be bold with those who think we act from human motives. We are human, but we don't wage war as humans do. We use God's mighty weapons, not worldly weapons, to knock down the strongholds of human reasoning and to destroy false arguments. We destroy every proud obstacle that keeps people from knowing God. We capture their rebellious thoughts and teach them to obey Christ." I love this. Now, I absolutely love this. So I want to read verse 5 again to you, and I want to read it to you out of the New Living Translation, which is what I just read it from. And then I also want to read it to you in the King James text, because I think it's wildly good in that version. 2 Corinthians 10:5 in the New Living Translation says again, "We destroy every proud obstacles that keeps people from knowing God." But here's the place that I want to land. We capture their rebellious thoughts and teach them to obey Christ. The King James Version says it this way: "Casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ." This is so good. This is so good. So what is it saying here is that you and I have a responsibility to hold captive, or to bring into captivity, every thought that is not in obedience to Christ. Every imagination, every possibility, the knowledge of the Lord. It is our responsibility as believers to take care of ourselves, to not just take care of what we are doing outwardly, not just what we are doing inwardly, but both. To take care that we are inwardly and outwardly pure, that we are maintaining righteousness. And listen, I am telling you that one of the very first things that we need to get a hold of is our thought. Now, I am one who always says that what comes from our mouth matters, and I still stick by that 100%. That you and I have no idea the damage that we do by our mouths. And I'm not just talking about gossiping about people, which is obvious, or talking negatively about someone, which is obvious. I'm talking about what is it that leaves our lips that has no business being there. Mom, it's 2 Corinthians 10:5. What is it that we are saying out loud? Because whatever we say out loud becomes the reality of the condition that we live in. So I am one that stands very steadily on that mountain. I will preach that until the day that I die. What we say, what we allow to leave our mouths, has more uh boy, it has more power than we think. That means that, everything that we say in terms of like ourselves, when we talk badly about ourselves, when we gossip about other people, when we get frustrated, when we that person pulls out in front of us in traffic and we say the not so kind words, when we aren't so kind to the cashier, when we belittle people, or when we make our husband feel bad, or when we don't serve people well, it all stems from what comes out of our mouth. But I want to trace that back a step further to what goes in the head. What is it that you are dwelling on? What is it that you are fixating your imagination on? It matters. It really, really, really matters. And it is our responsibility as believers, as followers of the Good Shepherd, to take very good care of how we are inwardly keeping pure and how we are externally keeping pure. And a big part of that goes back to this verse, bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. It is basically training our thought life. It is training our thoughts. It's saying, no, you are not going to think about that. No, you're not going to dwell upon that. It means getting up sometimes, like I've done, in the middle of the night, and I have something that's going on in my life that is bringing me a lot of anxiety, or that is maybe bringing me a lot of dread, or I woke up sick in the middle of the night and just feared because I had something going on that week that I had to be at, and here I was sick. It means getting up and praying against the thing that is causing our thought patterns to go down this rabbit trail. It is saying no to our of letting our imaginations run wild. It is saying, no, my thoughts, I am able, as a believer in Jesus Christ, who has the power of the resurrected Christ who lives within me, to take captive every single negative thought, or every single thought that does not line up with the fullness of Jesus Christ. It is training our thoughts. J. Walker D.D. is one of the commentaries that I read on this. And I want to read to you what J. Walker says. He says this: we are competent. Listen to this, friends. We are competent in a moment, freely and deliberately, to select out of a train of thoughts that one which we will attend. What we do from the impulse of a moment depends on the state of our minds. And this again depends, for the most part, on what we have chosen to make it or allow it to become. So let's go back and dissect this for a minute. We are competent at any moment, freely and deliberately, to select from these train of thoughts one that we're going to rest our mind upon. So think about this. We wake up in the middle of the night. We have something going on tomorrow that is causing us all kinds of dread and anxiety. We wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and all we can fixate it on is how awful that is going to be, and how much we are dreading that thing, and how we are just absolutely filled with anxiety about that. We are dreading it with everything that is in us. And we've actually physically made ourselves sick because we just can't wrap our brain around how we're going to make this thing work. We know it is just impossible. We have this train of thoughts. We're thinking on this, and yet we're also wrestling, right? Because if you're a believer, you're wrestling with the fact that God is good. He's going to carry me through this. He has got me in the palm of his hands. He's not going to let me go. He says, do not be afraid. Do not be anxious about anything. I am with you. Come to me that is on the water, and I will take care of you. Come to me, those who are weary, and I will give you rest. We're thinking about all of these things, right? And so we have these, what he is calling this train of thoughts. And he says, we have in us the ability to think about the one that we are going to attend to. The one that we're going to attend to, because listen, the thought that we give all of our mind to and our attention to is the thing that is going to grow. So the more that we think about the negative thing, the more that we are fixated on the problem, the more that is going to grow. And suddenly we find ourselves in the state that Much Afraid was, is looking at this filled with so much dread and so much anxiety. And yet, look, it wasn't nearly as bad as she had pictured it. It wasn't as nearly as bad as she had anticipated. I often think what God must think. He sees the outcome. How much must he look down on us and go, if only you could see the places that I see. If only you could see the end of the beginning. I know for you, you cannot see it, but I'm already there and I've already taken care of it. And I've already done everything necessary to get you through that situation victoriously. If only you could see it. And we can't, of course, but we can train our thoughts. Now, he goes on to say, what we do from the impulse of the moment depends on the mind. This is a renewal. This is what Romans 12:1 says, the renewing of your mind. We hold captive every negative thought is not it was not subject to the obedience of Jesus Christ. We hold them captive. Now, this doesn't mean just getting rid of the bad thought. Now, I want us to get this clear. It is not just a matter of choosing to not think about that bad thought or to dwell on old thoughts. So this isn't just getting rid of a bad thought or choosing to dwell on an old thought that once led you into sin. Now, I'm not talking about that. But you and I must not only repel that evil thought, that bad thought, that thing that is causing us so much worry and dread and anxiety. We must repel it, but we also must replace it with something else, something better. For instance, I want to give you a scenario. Now, maybe this is not just for me, maybe it's for somebody else, but I want to give you an example, a practical example of this. If I don't want to keep thinking of the chocolate cake that I want so badly, it's not going to be as easy as just stop dwelling on the chocolate cake, Wendy. You need not have that thing, right? It's going to take a little bit more than that. I have to replace it with something else. For instance, it is shifting my mind on something else, something that I can have, something that would be better for me. For instance, I've gotten into this, again, just being real, just coming to you with a practical lesson. I have reduced my sugar intake greatly the last, I would say, 3 or 4 years. I, along with several other people in my family, only consume approximately 5 to 7 or 8 maybe grams of sugar in a setting. So that means that I have drastically cut out the sweets in my life. I've completely cut out sugars that would be filled in cakes and pies and cookies and all of those things. But what I have done, instead of denying myself the thing that I know that I want so badly but can't have or shouldn't have, I create myself opportunities to have the thing at hand that I can have. So what I do is I go out and I buy protein bars, or I buy those really low sugar granola bars to have on hand. I never leave us without them, because I never leave myself without an option, without an excuse. Why? Because I know me. I know that my tendency in my flesh is to go to the chocolate cake because it's easy, it's good, and it's the best thing on planet Earth, right? I know this about myself. And so if we know these things about ourselves, if we know we have a tendency to think the negative thought, then what do? We have to replace it with something better. We have to go, you know what? I remember that time that I really dreaded this thing that I had to do, and I had regulation. The propensity, what are those things that by nature we are disposed to doing? If I know that when I go into a bar, I have this tendency to want to drink a drink, and I know that I'm trying not to, then I just avoid the bar, right? I know that if I want the chocolate cake, I just avoid going to the places, where they sell cakes and pies and cookies and donuts and all of the things that I love so much. I just avoid those places. I have to regulate that. Regulation, listen to this, regulation means adjustment, arrangement, governance, managing, supervision, guidance, and direction. And listen, you and I get the opportunity. We have the opportunity because, again, we have the power of the resurrected Jesus Christ living within us. We have that strength, we have that power, and we have the assurance of victory. If you are a child of God, you can take control by regulating those desire propensities. I love that. Now let's go back. I want to read verses 3 to 5 in their entirety, and I want to read it with a few notes. Let's go back, and I want to read to you this. It says, "We are human, but we don't wage war as humans do. We use mighty weapons, not worldly weapons, to knock down the strongholds of human reasoning and to destroy false arguments." Like human reasoning. You and I who belong to Jesus Christ, we no longer are under the jurisdiction of human reasoning. We have within us the ability to think from a kingdom mentality. You and I are supposed to think from the heavenly realm, to think in a heavenly perspective with a heavenly mindset. We are not to think with human reasoning. So it says that we knock down those strongholds of human reasoning and to destroy the false arguments. We destroy every proud obstacle that keeps people from knowing God. And then we capture their rebellious thoughts. It is this defensive warfare in this moment. This is like a military word. It is the operations of an aggressive army. It's this operation of an aggressive army. So we capture their rebellious thoughts and we teach them to obey Christ. It's like taking out every single bad thought and replacing it with something good, with something new, with something better. And after you have become fully obedient, it says in verse 6, we will punish everyone who remains disobedient. This is a war on our thoughts. It's a war on our thoughts. Listen, the enemy would love to get us down by creating in our minds false ideas and imaginations and anticipating awful things that are to happen. Because why? Then we would want to quit, and then we would have the propensity to quit because we are human and our weakness is sin. And we would have the propensity to go backwards. The King James Version, again, uses this word imaginations. It says, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God. So my commentary suggests that these are bold speculations. When he's talking about imaginations, they are bold speculations. Like I am totally speculating here. There's no facts and data to back this up. It is sophistical reasonings and then false philosophies, all which either deny God's existence or they distort his character and misinterpret his will. In other words, they're false, and we have no business paying attention to them. The truth is that all of these things are made high things in our life. When we decide that we are going to be so worried and so anxious over that thing that may or may not happen, right? Then we are giving high thinking to things like learning and intelligence and rank and wealth and popular applause. And those are the things that we don't want to hold in high regard. We want to hold up the name of Jesus, the truth of the gospel message. These things we want to promote, the knowledge of God, are rather low and humble and obscure. And so we need to pay attention to what is it that we're fixated on? What is it that we're thinking of? What is it that we are keeping our eyes laser focused on? Yes, Melissa, transformation of the mind. It is a new way of thinking. And it's not, again, just deciding that I'm not going to do something, but it is replacing it with something good or something better. It's leaving us a no options living, which we've talked about since the beginning of this book. A no options living would say, I am not allowing myself any options for failure here. I am going to keep Jesus in my eyesight. I'm going to stay focused, laser focused on him and on his gospel message. And I'm not going to live with all of these false human reasonings. I'm going to give myself fully and completely over to God, casting down imaginations. That means the second that you even think thought that is against what God's will is for your life or against what God's will is for us, for believers, we grab them, we keep them captive, and we replace them with something new. And I'm telling you what, this is the work that the enemy does not like us to do, and is the work that is most necessary. Why? Because it starts in our heart, it goes to our head, it comes out of our mouth, and